And the reason why we were able to have those conversations is because I took a gap year. I took 2 gap years. And a lot of people, I used to talk about this story much more with when I was younger or earlier in my education career. But part of the reason why I'm so passionate about considering gap years when it's a good option for students is because my gap years were so transformative. And I won't spend an enormous amount of time talking about how I spent my time, but it did set the tone for how I think about what role a gap year plays in a student's life. Because for me, what it was the first time I was responsible for my own life and for my own learning, and learning as different from studying. It was the first time I really could understand that learning inside the classroom, learning inside school in a high school curriculum is actually quite different from the majority of the learning that we're going to do in life. And to have this have this period of time where you get to be in charge of what you want to learn and how you want to learn it can be a pretty profound opportunity. And I think, again, each of these 3 students did it in their own way. Zhang had a very specific, I want to learn how to sing technically, right? This is a skill I'm going to develop. I want to improve these languages and potentially consider some new languages, right? I have very, very concrete goals for some academic subjects. For Bing, it was much more, there's a set of ideas related to political philosophy and philosophy that he's like, I really want to sink my teeth into these ideas and ruminate a little bit, because I haven't had the chance to really think about these things in high school. The opportunity wasn't available to me. So I'm going to create that opportunity for myself. And for Huyen, it was, I'm going to get outside of my comfort zone and kind of see who I am when I'm in different circumstances, when I'm in Malaysia, when I'm in Costa Rica. And all of that is learning, right? All of that is growth, but it is a different kind of learning than what we're accustomed to in formal education. And probably, I mean, for Bing and for Zhang, it's still early, but Huyen might be able to tell you, and certainly for me, it sets the tone for kind of the rest of your education and kind of the way that you think about your own learning, because suddenly you realize that for the rest of your education, everything is about opportunities and resources. If I want to have an experience, if I want to know something, if I want to become expert in something, if I want to be or achieve a certain position, I need to look for the resources that will help me get there. And I think gap years are the opportunity for us to develop that skill of being like, I have a goal. How am I going to meet that goal? And I need to create that basically entirely for myself, because no one else is doing it for me. There's no high school curriculum anymore. I'm outside of the box. And that, I think, is an invaluable skill to learn, because that's what college is. By the time you get to college, and I say this to all my students, and I say this to all of our parents, college really, at its most kind of basic fundamental level, is just a set of resources. A set of resources that you get to determine how you take advantage of. Classes are resources, faculty are resources, the student population, the culture, the internships or research, right? All of the different components of a college experience come down to the offerings that the school has developed and cultivated over the course of, I don't know, its 100+ year existence. And it's up to you as a student to select those, right, very intentionally. And one of the things that a gap year can do is teach you how that decision-making process happens. Do you need a gap year to learn that? No, but it definitely, in the process of developing your gap year and how you're going to spend your time, you definitely have to do that thinking, right? Otherwise, so many of the questions that we're getting in the Q&A are, how do I stay disciplined, right? How do I stay accountable? And the question of accountability and discipline is so fundamentally different when you are selecting for yourself how you spend your time. Usually discipline and accountability is an issue when we're doing things that we don't have full choice in doing, when we're taking a high school class that we're not really that interested in, or we don't really care, or our parents told us to do something, or whatever it happens to be. But it's a totally different dynamic when you have done the work of being like, what do I love? What makes me happy? What makes me interested? What's exciting to me? And what if I invest a week, a month, 6 months of time into exploring this? Then the issue of discipline is just it's kind of different, because you're doing things that fundamentally you have buy-in, right? You have fundamental buy-in because you got to make all those decisions. So I just wanted to kind of remark on that a little bit, because I think that context for what the gap year is different from like the strategic function of the gap year. Will it help me get into college? Does it look good on my application? And I think it's really important to separate those two things. You know, will it help me in my application, or does it look good in my application? Versus, truthfully, all your time actually like belongs to you in life. And if we're living a good life, you're determining how you spend that time. And a gap year is that experiment, right? The opportunity of the gap year is to experiment. How do you get to spend your time when the choice is yours? Most high school students have no idea, right? Most high school students are like, oh, I don't know, because they haven't been given that opportunity before. And that's where someone like a Spark Prep or a coach can come in and kind of structure that conversation with you a little bit. So here's how we might structure the conversation. Usually, I'll ask my students to break down their goals into kind of a few different areas. One, are there intellectual areas that you would like to further develop or learn, right? Is there learning more in the traditional sense? Is there knowledge actually that you'd like to acquire? Do you want to develop a skill like computer science? Do you want to develop a language like French or Spanish? Do you want to read a bunch of philosophy or history? And that takes a little bit of experimentation sometimes. Sometimes students don't really know, what they want to learn, or they're really tired of learning. And so we got to do a little bit of experimentation to see like what might be fun. And then you put some structure, right? Maybe it's like 20 books, or maybe it is an online class, or maybe it's a structured program. Then there's the other stuff that is a little bit more intangible, like how do you personally want to develop? Do you want to take up an academic an athletic or a physical discipline? Like, do you want to learn yoga? Do you want to develop more independence and self-reliance by like traveling, and all of a sudden you're in charge of feeding yourself three times a day, right? For me, one of the most, profound parts, and I think really interesting things during my gap year, but the fact that I like had to pay rent, buy my own groceries, and do my own laundry was in some ways like the most, kind of the most profound, or one of the most profound things, because I was just being an adult, right? Like at 18, all of a sudden, like I was an adult and had to learn how to be an adult, and everybody learns that in their own way. So sometimes you might just have very personal goals. Like, I just want to know what it feels like to be independent. Okay, cool. How can we structure that? And then there are sometimes like technical things. Do you want to learn an art form, right? Like Zhang was like, I've always wanted to learn how to sing. I'm going to invest some time into that. I haven't really had time to do that in high school, so I'm going to take lessons. And now singing is a part of her life, right? And because you have access to it, you've developed a little bit of momentum there. I think one of the things that all of these students have in common, and certainly one of the things I certainly recommend, and this very much takes care of the discipline for it in a lot of situations, is getting outside of your comfort zone. And Huyen will remember this conversation probably very clearly. Mostly I'm telling students to go somewhere else. If you cannot stay at home, if it's possible to be outside of your home, where the comfort of your parents and your having your household and your bed and whatever, like the familiar, comfortable environment, that usually will trigger our habits to be the same way. But if you go somewhere else, a different city, if that's within your means, and it's not necessarily within everyone's means, but to be outside of your comfort zone, it sharpens our awareness in a way that we've never experienced before, because all of a sudden you have to think about, am I feeding myself 3 times a day? Or like, if I get a job in another city, I have to show up at that job, right? I had a part-time job. I actually several jobs during my gap year, and I needed to work. And so I was accountable to someone else, my employer. So I will almost always ask my students to think about getting outside of their comfort zone. And that's different for everybody, right? Everybody's comfort zone is a little bit differently. So I'm not going to tell every single student that they should go to Alaska or go to a different country or whatever it happens to be. But I will have a conversation called like, where are you most comfortable right now? And is that getting in the way of any particular kind of growth where if we put you outside of that for 6 weeks, a month, 2 months, 3 months, that could be a really valuable experience. And Bing will remember this conversation. I was like, you can't know how you're going to grow until you get outside of your comfort zone. One of the things I remember telling Bing was just go. And then you will actually know just by being in a different environment, you'll feel different and then the learning can begin. Because as is the case with so many things, the plan that we make for our gap year is never exactly how the gap year pans out. You set some things in motion and you have some kind of like large buckets, right? This period, I'm going to do this, and this period, I'm going to do this. But opportunities come up, right? Opportunities come up. So the most important thing is to get started. And I think getting started sometimes like in a drastic way can really give you some momentum. The other thing is you got to give it time, right? And I think I gave this to both Bing and Nguyen. You can't just be gone outside of your comfort zone for a week, because it does take you a little bit of time to settle into a new environment and kind of, give yourself some breathing room to get into a new routine, right? So if you're going to go somewhere for like at least 3 weeks or a month, or really as long as you can, so that you can experience yourself in a new environment. Once you're in that new environment, you're going to change. It's guaranteed. How you'll change, I don't necessarily know, but that is like in some ways like the first thing that I will have students think about is, can we just like get you into a new environment? Now, parents often will want a lot more structure than that, understandably. And so definitely setting some goals, right? Like really looking at what does a successful gap year look like and feel like requires kind of looking at a timeline. And so I'll usually have students think about, depending on how long, like when they graduate, there's basically 2 periods to your gap year. There's the time that you graduate from high school in June to the time when you actually like submit your applications. Actually ends up feeling very, very short. For some people, it can feel very short if they're taking a gap year right after grade 12. I don't think we said this, but Zhang actually took a gap year after she had already applied to college and gotten it. So she basically deferred a year. That's different kind of from taking a gap year after you graduate from high school. So if you graduate from high school and then you take a gap year, period 1 is between your graduation and when you submit your applications. Actually, a lot of that time is going to be spent working on your applications. It's really only 6 months or so. And not 100% of your time belongs to you. So that additional pressure of having to work on your applications sometimes can feel like you're not really getting the most out of your gap year, sometimes. Then phase 2 is once your applications are done, and then your time really belongs to you because you're not doing the gap year for your application because the application's already done, right? And that's usually from January until August when you actually like matriculate. Now, sometimes there can be updates that you send to colleges, but those 8 months, those 7 or 8 months actually is kind of like the real gap year. But you think about them in terms of 2 different ways. The first phase is like stuff that will impact your application. And the second phase will not impact your application that much. Unless you take 2 gap years like I did. And then you have like an entire calendar year to do a bunch of different things. Now there are a couple tools. Zoe mentioned SMART goals. SMART goals are a way to really give you a lot of precision around the way that you structure your time. SMART goals stands for, literally, it's an acronym. It spells out specific, measurable, what's the A? Specific, measurable, achievable means something that you can actually do, relevant actually to your goal, and time bound. Time bound is really, really important because it means like become a billionaire is not a SMART goal because it's not necessarily time bound. Or like if in fact your goal is to learn yoga, or as Zhang said, get a particular certificate for a language in French, then it maybe isn't relevant to start learning Japanese, right? So whatever, SMART goals are a way to kind of structure and bring focus to a project. Usually we use SMART goals within the framework of a project. And so you can think of a gap year as a project, a project that's being managed or a project that's being designed. And so when you think about SMART goals, we're thinking about things that are bound within the time of your gap year, relevant to your gap year, achievable to you, measurable, right? Measurable means I know it when it's done, it has a beginning and an end. And whatever the S is, specific. Specific means specific, probably the word I use most in my professional life. So I'm at that time, and you guys all remember, we're at the time of essay writing with my students, where every single meeting with my students, I'm like, cool, how can we make this sentence more specific? Yeah, so this paragraph needs a little bit more specificity. I don't know if you guys remember me talking about specificity, just like ad nauseum for days and days and days. So we talked about a couple of different things. We talked about kind of thinking about your gap year as an opportunity to learn, as distinct from studying, right? High school oftentimes is like studying because someone else told me to. And gap years can often be a time of learning for your own personal validation. We talked a little bit about kind of situating it within the broader framework of what your growth goals are. I think I'll kind of wrap up a little bit, talking a little bit about just what it takes in order to like have a gap year be successful, because I think it's important to understand that because it's a risk, not a bad risk, not necessarily a dangerous risk, but a risk as in it exists outside of the standard trajectory. It does take some courage. It takes some courage to take a gap year. It takes some boldness. And so the characteristics that students often need are open-mindedness and trust and a growth mindset, a desire to discover and willingness to experiment with things. I haven't really had a student go through a gap year that ultimately they didn't find very valuable. Probably all three of these students would tell you, did it look exactly the way that I thought it would look? My guess is if they would say no. Will you guys nod? Is that true? Did it look the way you thought it would look? Sorry, yeah, I phrased that weird. It did not look the way that you thought it would look, right? So, and yet probably it was still worth it in a way that was certainly had some bearing and relevance to their college applications, but I think more importantly, shaped them as individuals, gave them an opportunity to cultivate some skill sets. And I don't know if they've had the opportunity to reflect on it yet, but when you get to college, you're kind of in a different place than some of your peers because you've experienced adult life in a way that's different from most other incoming freshmen, or in Zhang's case, sophomores who are coming to campus for the first time. I know I just did like a very long kind of like epic monologue. Zoe, are there any like specific questions or things that maybe we can just have like a little bit of dialogue? Are there things that I can like clarify or things I didn't address that you want me to talk a little bit about? Happy to have a little conversation.